Can I welcome Anne Wilson from Swiss Re, Senior Vice President. I think in the details you've got her biog, but just say I think she's got the best title in the world from reading the biog. Leader of Natural Catastrophe Expert Leadership Network. Have I got that right?
Expert Network.
Yeah, okay. I thought. Well,
although I think we've rebranded ourselves as the Forethought Network.
Oh, even better. Yeah. So I mean, with that in mind, I think we'll just leave it to you. So, welcome.
Thank you. As Simon said, I've worked primarily in the natural catastrophe world in the Americas, which means I've been very busy the past couple years with natural and man-made catastrophes. So I welcome the opportunity to come share some of that information with you. I am tied to my laptop this morning. Our clicker is not functioning, so I'm going to stay here. Please interrupt me if you want to ask questions. It's a small group, which I like. So if one area is of more interest to you than any others, send me back, stop me, and we'll just make this a conversation more than me talking to you. So those of you that were planning to sleep, you're going to have to at least stay awake for that part of it. How many of you have anything to do with property catastrophe losses? Okay. How many of you work with the Americas region? Okay, so you might know as much, if not more, than I do. How many of you just want to know whether you should book your holiday to Disneyland for next year? Okay. I think that might be discouraging, but I think you might be okay.
It's not going to make it onto the tourist.
No. Disneyland, I'm sure, has private firefighting on standby anytime they see something in the hills. Last year, I was flying down to Australia to talk about the hurricane losses, and I was changing planes at LAX on the tarmac and saw the Woolsey fire burning in the hills, and I knew I was going to have another busy year. So why is this an important issue for us? If it feels like you've been hearing a lot more about wildfires, that's not your imagination. If it feels like our industry is suffering much larger losses because of these events, that's not your imagination. We've got some data to back that up. This shows the insured losses in the Americas, Canada, and the US over each decade from the 1980s to this recent decade. You can see the total losses, that thin blue line from the 1980s were under $1 billion. Jump forward to where we are today, about 40 billion in losses this decade. You can see the prior years, 16, 17, and 18, make up a big portion of those losses. And just to put it in perspective, we'll see the numbers from recent losses. Single losses in 2017 and a single loss in 2018 exceeded the total losses for the prior decade. So it's not your imagination. The insured losses from these events are increasing.
Sorry, if I can ask questions, how would that compare if you looked at it in terms of the total loss as opposed to the insured loss? So is that partially insurance penetration, or is it just because the losses are just much worse?
The losses are much worse. In the U.S., people have fire insurance. It's not where you have the gap in some other, or you have trouble getting it on the coast, or you're in areas where people don't pick up insurance. Most people have fire insurance, so it's going to be covered. You will see that there was a bit of a gap. Economic losses come in from other sources, the suppression efforts, government entities that are self-insured. There'd be an uninsured loss. And then also, as we'll discuss, there was a big gap in the limits that were available to rebuild. So 6 of the 10 largest fire losses have occurred in the past 3 years. This shows it a little more graphically. We're insurance people. We always ask, is this a frequency or a severity issue? The answer is it is a frequency and a severity issue. So the number of large fires has increased each decade. So now there's about 20 more additional large fires defined as losses in excess of 400 hectares. So we're seeing far more of these losses. The amount of land that is burning, the square miles that have burned increases continuously from about 3 million to now about 10 million. And the wildfire season is getting longer, to the point where it's not really so much a season, it's just an existing way of life in California. I woke up one morning to a radio interview with someone in California during the 2017 fires, and they had interviewed CAL FIRE, which is the agency responsible for responding and controlling the largest fires, and they said they've had an active fire every month since 2012. So it's a continuing and concerning trend. And we're always asked, why is it? Why is it getting worse? There's a couple different reasons, and none of them are going to explain it entirely, but certainly the changing exposure. They follow closely the wildland-urban interface. That's that area where the wild, undeveloped areas are meeting the developed communities. Those are increasing in size, they're increasing in population, and they're increasing even more in the number of structures that are being built in those areas. There's also been a greater accumulation of the fuels that burn these fires. A lot of factors around that. There's been a move away from controlled burns. People don't like to see the hills burning. It upsets them. They like trees. That's the reason they've moved to these areas. Forestry has decreased in these areas. And the government entities that are responsible for maintaining the forests and doing some level of prevention haven't had the funds available to them during the recession era. So yeah, there's an increase in the fuels that are causing these fires and spreading these fires. And then finally, the people that are living here are causing the problem. We talk about natural catastrophes. Wildfires generally are not natural catastrophes. Occasionally, a lightning strike will be the cause of these fires, but 84% of them are human intervention. Sometimes it's arson, sometimes it's unattended campfire. More and more frequently, it's being caused by the services that are moving into these areas to serve the population that is increasingly moving to these areas. So we are looking at continuing conditions of an increase in wildfire exposure.
Sorry.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Question. You know the interface that you were talking about?
The WUI.
The WUI. How is that growing? Is that like a border, or is it just the area that it's covering? I don't understand.
They define it as the area within. I will have to check on the actual geographic distance where the traditionally wild areas have now been developed, and that area is increasing because what used to be wild, people love to build up next to forests. They love to build up next to the mountains and the wild spaces. It makes them feel part of nature, even though they're in a tightly built subdivision.
And sorry, the 84% that includes infrastructure, like some utilities?
Yes, yeah. It's some human intervention. It's not a natural occurring phenomena. And we'll talk a lot about the utilities exposures to these fires. The changing climate conditions are increasing the likelihood that these are going to happen. So, like all good things, it's not just the Americas that are going to be suffering these. Obviously, Australia has a lot of brush fires. We're starting to see them in Europe. Greece had a large brush fire. France has conditions that are ripe for this. As temperatures warm, these conditions are more likely. When the temperatures rise, the snow melt or whatever moisture is preventing these fires from starting or spreading, it melts earlier, the conditions are drier for longer, and it's far more likely that the wildfires are going to occur. And then, I thought this was curious, the wildfires themselves generate so much heat that's increasing the temperatures. And so the next season is sometimes a little bit more likely to see these events because the temperatures have risen in the area because of the extreme temperatures from the wildfires. So the reason this is, and I've heard the puns all week, a hot topic, a burning issue, is because there were really large fires in 2017 and 18. The first set of fires came in Northern California in 2017, and I won't spend a lot of time. For those of you who work in this industry, you're pretty familiar with the losses. 13 fires burned at once. 3 of them were large enough to be given a PCS catastrophe designation, which means they had insured losses in excess of $25 million. $11 billion in total insured losses. $8.5 billion was from a single fire, the Tubbs fire that burned in wine country. A couple months later in Southern California, there was the largest geographic footprint from a wildfire in the Thomas fire. So 273,000 acres burned. It was the largest, and I say was the largest wildfire in California history, and it did $2 billion in insured losses. And then curiously, we have mudslides up here because they are part of the wildfire losses. This is how it worked. About 2 months, about a month after the Southern California fires, there was a mudslide in the area where these burned. And for those of you familiar with Santa Barbara, it was a mountain community right outside of Santa Barbara. Multi-million-dollar homes, $10 million, $20 million homes in this area. The Department of Insurance, based upon some existing case law, immediately issued an order saying that yes, we know it's a mudslide, and yes, your policies might exclude earth movement, might exclude flood, which is exactly what a mudslide looks like. This is actually covered under the fire loss, because but for that wildfire that burned in December, this mudslide wouldn't have occurred. And there's legitimate science behind that, and there's case law supporting that interpretation. The ash and the other debris, the scorched earth, it creates kind of almost a hard shell. So the water doesn't penetrate it, but it loosens that shell and the whole thing slides down. So if the efficient proximate cause of the mudslide is the fire that occurred recently, then it's going to be covered as a fire loss. So on top of all these other losses, another $432 million in insured losses were made part of this complex of claims. The causes behind them, and this is important because we'll talk about sources of recovery and subrogation. Tubbs was caused by wiring on private property, a home that the homeowner hadn't even lived in for a while. The caretaker had been checking in on it periodically, or might have been living on the property at points. So unfortunately, the utility company, which had been the target of liability claims, was found not to be the cause of this particular $8.5 billion fire. Good news for PG&E, short-lived good news for PG&E. But now the insurance industry doesn't have a deep pocket source of subrogation to recover the losses that we've paid for these Northern California fires. Now, for 11 of the other fires, they were found to have originated in the utility company's equipment, which makes them liable for these losses. The Thomas fire was caused by utility equipment, Southern Cal Edison, another utility that operates in Southern California. So they now are responsible for the mudslide losses as well. 2018, in November, the Camp Fire started. It started and spread very quickly, and completely destroyed an entire town, almost overnight. Actually, I think it was overnight. This is no longer a matter of property destruction. 85 lives were lost in the Camp Fire. We show statistics of the worst fires in California history. I think the prior largest number of deaths had been 11 from these wildfires. So this is a significant change in the danger that the Californians are facing. Estimated economic damages of about 16.5 billion and over 9 billion in insured losses, and I'll explain a little bit of that gap. Some of it is some private entities that aren't or public entities that aren't insured, but a lot of it is just a insurance gap in our market. The Woolsey fire ignited on the same day, far away, hundreds of miles away in Malibu Canyon, an area of very high value homes, and did about $4 billion in insured damages. And that's the small fire for the year, and would have been by far one of the largest fires in prior years. So these causes, pretty clear, although there has been no official finding of the cause of the Camp Fire. Very clear that PG&E is liable for it. It did start in their equipment. They've so much as acknowledged it. And the Woolsey fire, it's alleged that it was caused by the equipment owned by SoCal Edison. So again, the same utility companies are facing liability claims from fires the next year. Yeah.
Just curious whether the insurance gap was due to people being underinsured, or whether it was actually insurers declining to cover?
It was underinsurance for most people, and we'll talk a little bit, and I'll show you the factors that are driving that. This is a snapshot of, I think, Tuesday. I took it off of a screenshot off of the internet. These are active fires burning this week. They're not causing property damage. You can see a few in California, some in Arizona, some in New Mexico, Colorado, and Washington. All of these areas have pretty high exposures to wildfires. They don't have the dense populations that California does, so it's not quite the same exposure. They don't have the home values that California does, so it's not quite the same exposure, but it's certainly something that we need to be aware of and be careful about the concentration of risk in some of these areas. Okay, so we talked a little bit about insurance to value. I'm just going to skip ahead to that. What's driving these issues? Unlike hurricanes or even tornadoes, sometimes wildfire causes complete and total destruction. It is rare that there is a partial wildfire loss to a home or sometimes to a business if they have, multiple buildings in a single location, or if there's just smoke damage, that'll be a partial loss. But the overwhelming number of these are total losses. And that's a picture of the area where it burned, and you can see how densely populated that is. These are subdivisions that were built generally by the same couple of builders or the same builder in the same period of time, close together, 10 to 15 feet, separating these buildings. So what we normally see after losses like this is a demand surge, right? The shortage of labor and materials to rebuild the number of homes that were destroyed is significant. So you see increases in costs of anywhere from 50 to 100%. Anecdotally, I've heard from clients that the demand surge was causing increases of about 600% for immediate bids they were getting, because people wanted to be the first, and as people were committed to the construction projects, it became more difficult to find labor. And so people want
no price gouging legislation, because if you get like a hurricane down in Florida, gas stations, everybody else, they can't increase prices, but
right.
These are individual builders. What can they do? I'll
yeah.
$20,000 or $2 million.
Yeah.
You
can't, it's supply and demand, and most people want the same builder that built their home, because a lot of these homes weren't there 10 years ago. They're, original owners. They want their original builder to recreate that building. So the demand surge was huge. It's gone down a little bit, but the fact was the limits that were in place were absolutely insufficient to cover the rebuilding costs. Even the extended replacement cost coverage, which usually adds another 25% to the limits or 50% to limits at most, was insufficient. So we're kind of looking at that. The remote locations make it a little more expensive. Sometimes it's the high value homes. When you're rebuilding a $10 million home, you're kind of picky about how it's being done. Not only do you want the Italian marble, you want Guido to fly in from Italy to install Italian marble. It's there are certain considerations. The high value home market did a little bit better getting the insurance to value correct on this, because they know what they're insuring. Agents who quickly need to set some limits on a new home policy aren't quite as good at anticipating events like this. So what we saw, you can see just within 2 years, in September of 2015, there was the Valley Fire. It had about an average homeowner's claim of $144,000. The commercial was a little higher, $425,000. 2 years later, for the Tubbs Fire, the average homeowner's claim was $333,000, and the average commercial claim was about $579,000. By London standards, those aren't high home values, and they're a moderate home value for California. So there is a protection gap, and what happens whenever there is a protection gap, someone's going to step in to fill it. If we don't do it as an industry, the legislature in California is going to quickly step in to do that. So what happened after the 2017 fires, even before the 2018 fires, the California legislature stepped into, they tried to do it on an emergency basis. The regulators tried to get some things through on an emergency basis that would have changed the coverages available for the 2017 fires. Those were less effective efforts, so we didn't see huge changes. But going forward, for admitted carriers to write in California, they're going to have to face some increased coverages. So some of these take effect only when there's a wildfire emergency declared. Some of them will take effect whenever there's an emergency declared. So if there's an earthquake, these will come into play. So if there is a declared disaster, your coverage A, so your dwelling and your outbuilding limits can be combined for a single limit, even if the outbuilding wasn't damaged. You won't be able to cancel or non-renew anyone within an area of the wildfire for up to a year. So getting out of that market's a difficult thing to do. If it's a total loss, they'll be able to rebuild at another location and still recover the replacement cost coverage. That's great. We don't want a rebuilding in the same place that has the same wildfire exposure. The time to rebuild is going to be expanded and collect under their policy. The additional living expenses, instead of I think it's 1 year, it has to be available for at least 2 years. And here's the key, that extended replacement cost coverage that most companies offer at 25%. If you don't offer at least 50% replacement cost coverage, you have to refer the customer to a website maintained by the California Department of Insurance that tells them all of the insurance companies that do. So I haven't heard how our clients are responding to that, but in a difficult area facing huge exposures from wildfires, suddenly the minimal coverages are a lot more expansive. So we're seeing a big growth in the excess and surplus companies coming in, and the FAIR Plan, which is California's governmental insurance kind of as a last resort. You have to be turned down by admitted carriers in order to qualify for it. The number of policies they've issued has, they had a record year. And the subrogation environment is interesting and daily getting more interesting. In fact, Tuesday of this week, PG&E settled with the public entities, so the cities that lost their buildings, the cities that might have incurred some firefighting costs. They settled for $1 billion with, I think it was 14 separate entities. PG&E has declared bankruptcy. Initially, they thought they were looking at about $30 billion over 2 years of claims, right? The 2017 fires and the 2018 fires. They got a little bit of relief when a year and a half after it started, CAL FIRE determined that the Tubbs fire, again, $8.5 billion, was not caused by PG&E equipment. Even then, PG&E said, no, we still have to file bankruptcy. So they sought bankruptcy protection this year. and are in the middle of a very active period in trying to resolve the claims from 2017 and 2018, and more importantly, any settlements they're talking about, they want some assurance that there's going to be a new way of allocating the losses going forward. So there's some legislation being proposed. PG&E will be able to participate in some of the legislative relief as soon as they get out of bankruptcy. So there's a big effort just to get everything tied up quickly. PG&E has until September to exclusively submit a plan to the bankruptcy court. After that, creditors can submit competing plans. So there's a flurry of activity right now, both from the legislature and from the bankruptcy estate, to try to come up with not only a resolution of these claims, but a better way going forward to allocate these losses. The reason the utilities and railroads and quasi-public entities are so concerned is they face strict liability. You don't have to prove that they were negligent in failing to care for the power lines or clear the trees away from the power lines, or that they did anything wrong. You just have to prove that their equipment started the fire. It's a theory of inverse condemnation. There's court cases that say that because the utility is like a governmental entity, if they take your property, then they must compensate you for it. So that's why PG&E is always the target. Whatever utility is nearby, whatever utility serves the area, they're usually the target for liability claims, even before there was any finding of the cause of loss for these fires. Suits were filed against the public utilities. PG&E is still the target of a liability claim, a lot of liability claims for the Tubbs fire, even though it didn't start in their equipment. There are allegations that they were negligent in allowing the homeowner to tie into the power the way they did, or they're still being pursued because they have had the deep pockets, but these pockets aren't infinite. So they're looking at more comprehensive solutions. And one of the things we're seeing in these events that we have not seen, at least at this level prior, is hedge funds, equity investors are coming in, contacting the insurance companies and offering to buy their subrogation rights against PG&E or SoCal Edison for a discounted amount of whatever their losses were. We participated in some of the conversations with the hedge funds and our clients. We've talked to our clients about the pros and cons of doing this. Obviously, the pro is there's certainty in the amount you're recovering, and there's immediacy in the amount you're recovering. There was initially some concern that because of the bankruptcy, it would be years before the insurance companies recovered subrogation. Right now, there's such a interest in getting things wrapped up that might not be the case. But right now, I think the largest portion of claims against PG&E, even insurance claims, subrogation claims, are held by hedge funds, and not coincidentally, the hedge funds also have been buying up PG&E stock. So what used to be, it truly is a hedge. They're trying to acquire control of the company. They've put through a slate of directors now to go in there. So it's a completely different environment than what we're used to as insurers. You used to pick up the phone and say, hey, your guy started the fire. You know, can you pay us? Sure, here, how much did you pay? Well, you know, settle it. Well, we're not sure he's liable. Yeah, we'll figure it out. It was a business to business decision. Now this is an equity play, which brings a whole new level of complexity to these issues. Including the fact that we're hearing these subrogation claims there are efforts to negotiate settlements that would include not only cash, but equity in the company. As an insurer, you decide whether or not you want to own equity in the company that you are likely going to be suing again down the road, because they do start these fires fairly frequently. So it is a complex but interesting part of these claims. So they're looking for comprehensive solutions, and I won't go into detail, but the most likely solution is a fund that will be funded by the utilities, obviously being passed through to the ratepayers. The impact on the insurers is the funds are unlikely going to be large enough to cover all the losses, and it is expected that as part of this, insurance companies will have to agree not to attempt to recover their full losses in these events. So if you're looking at these losses and what you paid net of subrogation historically, you might not be able to look at that as a reasonable recovery rate. So it's, you know, we're going to be part of the solution. Not only are we paying these losses, we will be unable to recover quite as much as we used to in the past. So we're asked a lot about what we should be doing from the underwriting side. Any underwriters in the room? Yeah. The truth is, it's complex. These are all the moving parts on what's increasing the wildfire risk. A lot of them you can examine, but the truth is the homes are going to be built where there's fuel, where there's topography, where there's human intervention. We understand the great need to do a better job of modeling these risks. Swiss Re is working on something. We don't have anything to bring out to our clients yet. It is still a matter of individually assessing risks. You need to pay attention to your concentration of risk in these areas in the Louis, but it's more difficult to model your exposure than it would seem, because so much of this, the wind is a factor, the climate is a factor, the things that we can't control for are the factors. It's a difficult place to do business, but there are a lot of things that we're focusing on as an industry in cooperation with some good organizations that are encouraging homeowners to become more responsible to protect their own homes. There are fire retardant materials that can be used in construction in these areas. There are defensible spaces that need to be set up around a home. Wildfires don't generally spread through the trees or burning on the ground. In California, the biggest concern is small pieces of burning embers floating through the air and igniting a home. The embers can travel up to a mile. The winds in California are really strong, and that's what's causing these fires to spread. So there's a lot of, the IBHS, which is the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. It's a great organization. Hop on their website, look at some of the information they have. They've started a campaign, Remember the Ember, and they're trying to educate the public on how to protect their own homes. They've done some great studies on using different materials. There's a great video that has a home built half with traditional materials and no defensible space, and half is built with more fire retardant materials, cement board siding, different types of roofing materials, and then setting up defensible space. Things like using rock instead of wood chips in your garden beds, having stone patios instead of wooden decks, things like that, and protecting the eaves, because a lot of the embers are going into open spaces in the eaves, in the vents. Simple things like that. And they just did an ember test. Half the home was destroyed, half the home was unburned. So you can take preventative measures, and we're hoping in the rebuilding process that people are doing that. And it's not that much more expensive than traditional materials. So no great solution to what to do, but it is a matter of paying a lot more attention to individual risks and trying to set up some preventative measures. So yes, there's the burning questions, pun. Stop me, have me go back, any areas of interest, I'd be more than happy to talk more on that. You guys showed up this morning. What are your questions? What are your concerns? What pieces do you find curious?
I've got one quick question. Yeah. So in terms of the rating environment, because if you're looking at a cost per home average across the piece, you know, doubling or more, and you've got a reduction in potential subrogation and recoveries, the rate rises must be huge in order to compensate for that, because otherwise you just couldn't write it.
If you're an admitted carrier, you're a homeowner carrier, you have to put the rate through the Department of Insurance, and they limit the rate increases each year.
But if all the insurers just lose money in the state off the back of that, then
That's why
bust.
the excess and surplus companies are having a lot of penetration. They are able to, I've heard, double rates recently on commercial lines. And I think part of it, you know, rate's one thing, but part of it is getting those limits where you need them, and anticipating that, you know, these are consumers. These aren't large corporations. These are consumers. At some point, they're going to say, I can't pay those types of premiums, and they're going to go to the fair plan or go to the excess and surplus carriers, which I think most of the companies I talk to aren't that concerned with. They're not that concerned to lose risk in California, because it has not been profitable for them in the past couple of years. There are areas, great. I mean, they're not the arid environments that are as exposed. They're not butting up to the wildland urban interface. So, you know, there's still a market in California, but I think it's like coastal Florida and the Gulf. You know, it's going to be more difficult, but you're living on the Gulf of Mexico. You face hurricane exposures. You have to be part of the solution. And I think they're starting to realize that too.
And in a sense, you were saying they have to renew for a year. Have you seen any sense of after that year pulling out, or is it still too early?
It's still too early. I don't know. I'm trying to remember when that legislation goes into effect, and it might be 2020.
Right.
So we're hoping there's no fires in 2019, especially if PG&E causes them. Our understanding of the bankruptcy laws is that the 2017 and 2018 claims are part of the bankruptcy estate and will be resolved there. Any losses occurring in 2019 while PG&E is still in bankruptcy will be an administrative claim of the bankruptcy estate and will take priority and be paid before the 2017 and 2018 claims if there's not some type of a settlement, which again is why there's a lot of interest in getting things resolved quickly. There was a question back here. Yeah.
Just on subrogation. Forgive me if this is old news. I'm is there any attempt to subrogate against the biggest producers of CO emissions for their role in climate change?
There have, I don't know if specifically from these events. I'll look into it, but I know the suits are filed. Suits are filed every minute. I don't know that they've gotten far. And I'm putting on my old lawyer hat. I think the matter of standing will come into play, maybe, and causation is going to come into play because there's a lot of intervening causes here too. So PG&E is the easier target in the subrogation world. It's called low-hanging fruit. You've got clear liability, you've got deep pockets. Lawyers are coming out of the woodwork. And that's a much more difficult case to make. I'm sure there's some environmental activists that are willing to take on that effort. California does a really good job of controlling emissions. They're more environmentally conscious than any state. So they understand, obviously, the concerns about global warming. But it's you can't draw a line at the border. No.
Have there been any changes to like building regs as a result?
Those are slower to be enacted. What happens is most local municipalities are responsible for those regulations, and they don't move quickly, and they don't move with a lot of consensus. So we think there's more impact in going directly to the insureds and the consumers and the homeowners and saying, hey, it's not more expensive to rebuild with cement board siding. It's not more expensive to put down rock and to watch your landscaping. and try to do more of a direct marketing than we still lobby for. I think it's a density of population issue more than the building codes, that they've got to find housing in California, and it's hard to tell people, you know, could you, I know the developer wants to put 100 homes in this area, could you maybe convince them to put 50 in? It won't be as profitable for them, but gosh, you'd be doing us a favor. It's not really as persuasive an argument. There's usually attempts, and there have been successful efforts in Florida and where there's hurricane exposure to get better building codes. Where there's flood exposure, there's better building codes. We haven't seen it with the same penetration on wildfires because everyone's exposed to fire. Just the ignition sources, in this case, happens to be a burning ember instead of someone leaving the pot on the stove.
How is the federal government getting involved in reducing the wildfires? Because I understand that they manage the majority of the forests.
Mm-hmm. California just committed $1 billion to forestry management and prevention. The federal government for the entire western U.S. in recent legislation committed $2 billion. Probably not sufficient. There's actually kind of a underground forestry group. The federal employees, the forest rangers at the parks, have an underground group that are on Facebook, and they're hilarious. Very critical of the current administration and any efforts to either control the forests or to protect any type of environmental issues there. So. This administration isn't the one to go to ask for a lot of funds, either on climate change or on forestry management. But their solution will be sell all the federal lands, wild lands, to a private entity and let them go drill on it. It's they have a different priority.
Despite, I think, blaming California.
Trump's actual suggestion was what they need to do is take rakes out into the forest and try to clean it up themselves.
Sure.
Not an effective forestry management. And I think the numbers were on here, but this isn't an easy situation to solve. There are 130 million dead or dying trees in California. There's 107,000 miles of power line. Yes, they should all be buried. You'd prevent forest fires if these were buried lines. You're not going to be able to bury 107,000 miles of lines, or even realistically maintain them.
You talked about the delay in subrogation, but ignoring that bit, what's the kind of typical sort of settlement sort of delay in the kind of the direct claim? Is it relatively quick, because you said it was mainly a sort of total loss and therefore it's quite easy to adjust? Or? Yeah.
They're not all closed, but because some of them weren't limits loss. But yeah, a lot of companies weren't even doing initial inspections. They were just calculating the actual cash value, which is the initial payment, even prior to the rebuild, based on market values, and sending checks so that the reconstruction could get started. Insurance companies have not been criticized at all for the way they're responding to these losses. A lot of times in floods or hurricanes, there's a lot of complaint about how slow how slow our industry is, even though we know that's more anecdotal than statistical. And in this case, we're not hearing those same complaints. I think people are generally feeling good about the way the companies are responding. They don't love their renewal premiums, and they don't love that it's harder to get the insurance. But I haven't heard the same types of Department of Insurance complaints that we get after a lot of natural catastrophes.
I guess that it's much clearer. You're not having the argument, was it wind-driven rain,
right.
Was it flood, that's excluded.
Fires covered.
Burned down.
Yeah, fires covered. Mudslides are apparently covered too because they're fires. Yeah. But natural catastrophes are a difficult thing for us. These are even more difficult, so they're preventable. We're just not doing a great job of preventing them. So.
Has there been thought about having like a reinsurance pool in order to distribute like this better, like statewide?
I haven't heard that recommendation. I think the idea is this utility fund, the wildfire utility fund, is going to serve kind of some of that. I'm trying to think, is there? I haven't heard a proposal. That doesn't rule it out, just because I'm not aware.
Just thinking that some homes eventually will be uninsurable.
Yeah, yeah. The fair plan is covering that piece of it, and like I said, their policies are way up. I'm guessing they might have reinsurance. We might be on it. It's not out of our. We do. You know, there's an earthquake commission in California that provides just earthquake insurance. Take-up rates very low. A lot of people are willing to go uninsured. For fire, every mortgage company is going to require that they have that policy. It's not always required for earthquake. Questions, comments? I don't know, how are we doing on time?
Well, we've got a couple of minutes, but thank you. Yeah, we've done questions. Right, well.
Thanks everyone for coming.
We thank you.